Hello, I'm Richard Cowling from Cape St. Francis in the Eastern Cape, South Africa, and a member of Friends of the St. Francis Nature Areas, or FOSTA. And I'm going to give a brief talk to explain why protecting our coastal zone is crucial for coping with climate change. I'll show what are the consequences of not protecting the coastal zone for damage to infrastructure, and therefore make a strong case as to why we need to protect this coastal zone. But I'm also going to appeal to our sense of awe about nature in describing some of the absolutely beautiful features of the remnant coastal zone in our region. Owing to problems associated with the coastal zone of the Cape St. Francis area, notably in a progressive erosion of the main beach, the Coca municipality commissioned a basic assessment report of the coastal zone between the boundary of St. Francis Bay at Otter's Landing and the Rocky Coast property to the west of the village. FOSTA collaborated very closely with the consultants who did this plan, and basically it provides us with an opportunity, us when I say partnerships between the community and Coca municipality, with an opportunity to intervene in the coastal zone where necessary without having to go through an EIA. And this is very important because any activity within 100 meters of the high water mark immediately triggers an EIA. This management plan will enable us to intervene without having to go through the laborious process of doing an EIA, provided we stick to the guidelines, the management guidelines in this report. The report is currently sitting with the Department of Environmental Affairs and Economic Affairs and Tourism, DEDIT, in Port Elizabeth, but it will be hopefully approved within the next month or two. This graph shows sea level rise between 1993 and 2021. It's only the last, 30 years or so. And it shows that the rate of sea level rise is increasing from one decade to the next. And during this period, sea level has risen on average 30 centimeters. This is absolutely alarming. And the situation is likely to get worse because we're just at the beginning of what will be an exponential increase in sea level rise. In other words, the rate of increase per decade is going to go up and up and up. There are all sorts of complex feedbacks in the global climate system. For example, unintended or unanticipated phenomena whereby certain processes that cause warming in our atmosphere are going to also accelerate exponentially. So the future looks dire in terms of coastal regions, and hence the importance of maintaining a good buffer of natural habitat along the coast to afford coastal communities some resilience to this climate change. And obviously, wherever possible, wherever there is still natural habitat, that must be preserved because it affords this greater resilience than where you have human-built infrastructure right to the high water mark. This slide shows an aerial photograph of the greater Cape St. Francis Bay area, taken in 1961 before there was any or hardly any development in the area. What I want you to notice is the large extent of mobile sand that existed at that time. There were 3 bypass dune fields: the Oyster Bay bypass dune field that originated in Oyster Bay to the west, and that extended virtually all the way to the Crom River mouth. The second bypass dune was the Tace Bay bypass dune, which comprised a bunch of sections which also entered into St. Francis Bay, and then the smaller Seal Bay bypass dune. These dunes are natural features, been operating for thousands of years, and were vitally important for supplying sediment to St. Francis Bay, which kept the beaches very healthy. This is the same area with the photograph taken in 2000, and we can see the amount of development that has occurred at both St. Francis Bay and Cape St. Francis. The important thing to notice is how much of these bypass dunes have been stabilized, mainly with Australian invasive plants, Acacia cyclops. But this, of course, the stabilization process, of course, has denied the sediment to St. Francis Bay, which has obviously, as we'll see in the next slide, had an impact on the beach health. So here we can see at the top the dune, the mobile dune at Santorini Bay being stabilized for the development of that township. Below we can see also the location of Irvine right in the dynamic dune zone, the pioneer dune zone, which should never be tampered with. It's a dynamic area, and it's really important for supplying sediment to the beach as well. And the consequences of these actions are vividly shown in the slide above, where we see a photograph of St. Francis Bay Beach in the 1960s, late 1960s. You can see all the sand of the Tace Bay dune field in the background, which under the influence of the prevailing westerly winds is blowing sediment into the beach. You can also see ephemeral dunes in the foreground that are still healthy. The situation photographed again in 2020 is completely different. Here we see huge amounts of erosion having taken place, and at high tide there is no longer a beach at St. Francis Bay. Okay, now I want to move on to the habitats specific to the coastal zone between Rocky Coast Farm in the west and the Otter's Landing in the east. This being the area that was identified for the coastal management plan that I referred to earlier. I'm going to be moving around the coast, pointing out some of the features of the biological features of the coast, as well as some of the problems that we face, stressing both the utilitarian value of these features, for example, in providing us with resilience against the impacts of rising sea levels, but also the sheer beauty of the biodiversity associated with our coastal zone. So one of the first major habitats that we encounter walking east from Rocky Coast Farm are the coastal seep wetlands. That's R1, those blue areas. Also the magnificent shell shingle dwarf shrublands, which are unique to our area. And then the coastal scrub R3, which is the coastal scrub, the area that's under the influence of salt-laden winds, and is usually comprises stunted vegetation. These three habitats in this area comprise the coastal zone. So let's go and have a closer look at them. Okay, the first slide at the top there, the top left hand, is one of the wetlands along the wild side with fat lilies or calla lilies prominent. The slide below it is the coastal scrub, which is dominated by a species of everlasting, but here we can see prominent the coastal oxtongue or Gasteria acinaciformis, which is a aloe-like succulent and flowers in midsummer. On the right we have a close-up of the beautiful shell shingle vegetation that occurs around the lighthouse and westwards to Rocky Coast Farm. It's associated with a massive buildup of fragmented shells pounded by strong waves. And the diversity in this vegetation is absolutely phenomenal. It has, as you can see in this small area here, probably 6 or 7 species. Many of the species are local endemics or red data book species. They're threatened with extinction. So some of the problems that Foster faces in this area are the proliferation of paths, fishermen and shell collectors wanting to get to the coast, take the shortest available route, and in the process destroy the natural vegetation. Foster is putting a lot of effort now into trying to regulate these paths and encourage people to stick to the main paths, try and separate cyclists from pedestrians and so on, just to reduce the overall impact. Along the Seal Point Boulevard, we're seeing the impacts of sea level rise with erosion of the coast. This is something that's not going to go away and will require remedial action, of course, and this is outlined in that coastal management plan that I referred to earlier. Another problem we have, which wasn't really anticipated but has developed over the last 15 years or so, is the proliferation of beto, Osteospermum incarnum. Here we can see a photograph taken by me in 2003, just near the lighthouse. We can see beautiful shell shingle vegetation in the foreground, and then the same area rephotographed in 2020 is just covered with beto. So beto is a pioneer plant. It's an indigenous plant. It occurs in disturbed areas only. And of course, with all the tramping and impacts that we've had in our region, it's managed to establish itself and is becoming an indigenous invasive weed. So Foster's putting a fair amount of energy into removing beto from key areas where it's having an influence on the biodiversity or the rest of the biodiversity. Okay, now moving to our second major sector of the coastline that was the subject of this coastal management plan, which is really from the beach, the main beach at Cape St. Francis, all the way along the beach to the entrance at Cape St. Francis Nature Reserve. The two major habitats here are what I refer to as M1, which are sand movement corridors. These are areas where there was originally mobile sand back up until the probably early 1960s when development started in the region. They're areas where development should never have happened because they're dynamic. They're important in supplying sand to the beach, but we can see sadly that lots of development did occur there. And then the second habitat is are dynamic frontal dunes. That's M2. These are dunes which are semi-mobile. They're always changing in configuration. Plants are being buried, exposed again. They're also places where you should never have development. And fortunately, in our situation, there are not many homes that are located in this habitat. Let's have a closer look at them. Here we can see the Cape St. Francis beach looking westwards, very healthy beach. These local transverse dunes that develop at times, but it's a wide beach with lots of space, lots of sand, very resilient to sea level rise. Here's a view below showing a common plant of the semi-mobile dunes, the sand dollar, Scaevola thunbergii, and also giving us another view of this beautiful, healthy beach. However, not the whole beach is in such a good state. The main beach, right at the southwestern corner of Seal Bay, has undergone a lot of impact because of development that occurred in those sand movement corridors that I referred to earlier on. You can see that you can see the stabilization happening for future development. This involved planting branches of Acacia cyclops, which eventually developed into a dense stand of this plant and trapped all the sand. This sand movement corridor extended all the way to the western entrance to the village. The darker looking color that you see at the margin of the village as it was then is all Acacia cyclops or roykrans that Foster has had to remove over the last 30 years. In order to get the Irma Boyson Reserve in shape again. So what people have done, unfortunately, is stabilize the semi-mobile dunes in front of their homes in an effort to protect them from sand impacts. So this has had a further negative effect on the beach width by tying up all that sand that should be available to nourish the beach. So we can see this very clearly in these two slides, the top one taken in 1980, before any of these activities had begun, and the bottom one taken in 2020, where you can see the dynamic or semi-mobile dunes have been completely stabilized using thatch and roykrans cuttings and so on and so forth. Now we move on to the final sector of the coastline that was covered by the Coastal Management Plan, and this extends from the end of the beach, the Cape St. Francis beach, all the way to Otter's Landing, and is almost entirely or is entirely included within the magnificent Cape St. Francis Nature Reserve. There are a whole array of habitats in this area that some of which do not occur elsewhere along our coastline. For example, these semi-stable coastal dunes, stable coastal dunes. M3, R4 is a saline wetland. The green areas are bits of fynbos thicket mosaic or struntfelt. These were the areas demarcated on the earliest aerial photographs, and they have expanded substantially, largely because developers planted roykrans in this area that spread. Foster has now removed all of that roykrans, but nonetheless the vegetation has stabilized. And then there are also some beautiful wetlands, S2 here, in the Cape St. Francis nature reserve, some which are within the coastal zone. So let's have a closer look at them. First habitat are these semi-stable coastal dunes. The region that these aren't as mobile as the ones I discussed earlier is that there's a lesser sand supply to them, because the beach here is largely rocky. In other words, there's a border of rocks which limits the amount of sand that is deposited on the beach, which therefore limits the amount of sand that could cover up plants. But there is nonetheless still enough sand to prevent non-dune plants from establishing here. And these dune areas include the richest flora, to my experience, on any frontal dune anywhere in the world. And there are a whole bunch of red data book species, a notable one being the garden root cat snails. This is a species of Hyabankia. It's a parasitic plant. You're only aware of it when the flowers emerge above the sand. They get covered they're sticky and get covered in a layer of sand, which forms a kind of a sandpaper which protects these delicate flowers from further sandblasting. And then also the hairy needle sunspurge, species of Heliophila, also a red data book species threatened with extinction. In the coastal scrub along the sector coast, the species complement is very interesting and very rich and very floriferous. In spring, it's a delight to walk there. And then, of course, there's the saline wetland, which is a result of two processes. One, the heavy seas that come from the west, and when they're big enough, they break right across the low altitude St. Francis Point, inundating this area with seawater, but there's also fresh water that seeps into this area from the dunes to the north. Here we can see a spectacular view of the remaining bypass dune in the Cape St. Francis Nature Reserve, extending from the beach at Cape St. Francis into St. Francis Bay and supplying that bay with sand. In the background, we can see a ridge of coastal scrub vegetation with ancient sand dunes that have hardened to form almost a limestone. At the bottom here on the left is another view of the bypass dune. We can see that a bunch of rocks have been exposed, and what they've exposed really is an ancient tool shop where early hunter-gatherers, and I'm saying dating back 100,000 years or so, used to make stone tools using the quartzitic rocks that are exposed there. And if you look very closely, embedded in the sediments there, which have now hardened, are stone tools as well as shells. These people were obviously some of the earliest humans that we know of, who were capable of making tools and doing the sorts of things that people like us could do today. And then the wetlands in the Cape St. Francis Nature Reserve are fantastic, and a wonderful array of species which grow nowhere else, very important to harbor pollinators, long-tongued flies, important habitats for a variety of animals. Unfortunately, one of these wetlands has been incised by a road leading from the end of St. Francis Bay down to the point, down to Otter's Landing, and this provides vehicle access deep into Cape St. Francis Nature Reserve, where people can dump their rubbish, but also enables perlemoon poachers to get access to the coast. Foster has in the past tried to close off this road, but this was not received well by the fishing community. Nonetheless, the Coastal Management Plan does make a recommendation for this road to be closed. So we end this talk with a beautiful slide of shell shingle vegetation with the fluffy beach indigo, red data book species in the foreground. I hope that I've imprinted upon you the importance of these coastal zones, of the coastal zone as something that will assist us, if we manage it effectively, to weather the impacts of climate change, notably sea level rise, but also because we need to conserve it for its own intrinsic value. These are awe-inspiring communities of plants and animals that should be looked after simply for their own delight. Thank you very much.